Welcome back to the Mature Male Podcast. I'm your host, Wes, a psychotherapist helping men mature through timeless wisdom and practical guidance. Today's guest is Dr. John Schinnerer. Dr. John earned his PhD in psychology from UC Berkeley and coaches men to greater success and happiness in both their home and work lives. He served as an expert consultant for Pixar's Inside Out and has deep expertise in high performance, stress management, man box culture, positive psychology, anger management, and creating thriving relationships. Folks, he does it all. Dr. John hosts his own podcast, which you should check out, the Evolved Caveman, where he coaches listeners on finding success and happiness. His online anger management course, which we'll also link in the notes, has helped over 20,000 people, and he recently received awards for Best Executive Coach and for Leadership in Healthcare. His micro courses on anger management and forgiveness for Simple Habit have been listened to more than 200,000 times. Dr. John, welcome to the Mature Male Podcast.
Thanks, Wes. Great to be here.
So, John, your work explores what you call the man box culture and its impact on male identity. You've mentioned studies about island cultures having unique traits that correlate with the restrictive aspects of masculinity that we see. Could you explain how self-reliance and stoicism can become negative components of masculinity when taken to the extremes, and how emotions like anger, stress, and lust have become signals of manhood in our culture?
Sure. Yeah. Let me back up a little bit and just explain the man box for those who aren't familiar with it, because I think it's a really important and powerful concept. The man box is the rules that we learn about what it means to be a quote unquote real man from society, from media, from peers. Sometimes it's from our fathers, sometimes it's from women, but it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere in our culture. And it starts at a really young age. According to research, it starts at the age of 4 or 5. As soon as we get into groups of boys, and then we start to police ourselves. And the rules are things like be the provider, don't back down, compete, and you're only as good as your last achievement. Be self-reliant, be stoic. In other words, don't feel. And there's some good and some bad in there. And then there's some of these traits that could be good and bad depending on how far we take them. And I see this a lot I work a lot with middle-aged men who are highly successful, worth a lot of money, and frankly are miserable. And they've done it all right according to the story that we're sold, that bill of goods that we're sold at a young age about what it means to be a successful man. And the problem I have is that we're not very nuanced in our thinking about these things, and to the extent that we've thought about them at all. But like, take self-reliance, for example. Self-reliance, think of it on a 1 to 10 scale, where 1 is we're reliant on everybody for something, for all the things we need. Not a very masculine position, not a place I want to be. Then if you take it to a 10, it means I'm completely self-reliant. I don't rely on anybody for anything. In fact, when I need help, I can't even ask for help because I'm a rock. I'm an island, to quote Simon and Garfunkel, for those of you who go back that far. So I think to think about these on spectrums and think, where am I on this particular spectrum and where would I like to be? Because I would offer that a lot of these, we want to be somewhere in the middle of these ranges where we want access to being reliant on other people, being able to ask for help, and being suitably self-reliant. The one that I have the biggest problem with is be stoic, which is don't feel. And if you go back to middle school, high school, and if you think about those times when you were brave enough to share an emotion like sadness or fear, anxiety, inevitably, at some point, you're going to get one of the following insults. And I apologize in advance for the swearing, the slurs, but I think it's important to talk about, and this is what we get typically. So if you show too much sadness or fear, inevitably you'll get one of the following insults. Dude, don't be such a pussy, don't be a little bitch, or don't be a little girl. And interestingly, all 3 of those are the epitome of the feminine. So the message there is, by all that's good and holy, don't be feminine. And so we learn that lesson really quickly, and after, I don't think it takes that many times of getting those insults before you're like, shit, I'm never showing that again. That's embarrassing. It's hurtful. So we jump back in the man box. On the other side of the emotional spectrum, on the positive side, if you show too much joy, love, romanticism, excitement, flamboyance, you'll get the following insults. Don't be so gay. Don't be a fag. And so we get that a few times. We jump in the man box and we're trained to effectively cut off 2/3 of the emotional spectrum. And we are human before we're male. And so we're essentially cleaving off huge parts of our humanity in order to fit in this restrictive man box, to conform, to be safe, really to belong. And the problem with that is the question I kind of came up with next is, okay, so if that's the case, what does that mean that we can display publicly in front of other people emotionally without fear of embarrassment or humiliation? And I would say it's three things. It's lust, because if I share with you, Wes, oh, she's so hot, I'd do her. That's lust. And it signals that I'm straight, I'm heterosexual. That's safe. The second one is stress. If I complain to you how stressed I am, it says I'm busy, I'm important, I matter. And the third one, I would say the biggest one, is anger. Some degree of anger, from irritation, frustration, annoyance, to anger, all the way up to rage. And the vast majority of our emotions get funneled or channeled through that anger lens. And we're not even aware of it, right? And it flips in a third of a second. So I've seen embarrassment in men flip to anger. What are you laughing about? Haven't you ever slipped on a banana peel before? That kind of stuff. Or anxiety flips to anger, or fear, or guilt, or shame. And we know that depression in men, sadness, comes out as irritability. And the biggest problem I have with that dynamic is, A, we have no awareness of it generally. But B, if you and I are really angry at each other and we're in a heated disagreement, all I'm trying to get you to do is understand how right I am and how wrong you are, so that you'll apologize to me. And the problem is also that we go to black and white, all or nothing thinking when we're really angry. So I'm externalizing all blame onto you. And I'm thinking, man, if Wes would just stop being such a fill in the blank, I wouldn't be so pissed off. So in my mind, it becomes all your fault. And the danger of that is that effectively cuts us off completely from any possibility of growth or introspection or evolution. I completely miss, what's my part in this dynamic? Like, what could I be doing better or differently? And so that's to answer the question of the lust, stress, and anger piece.
Yeah, I appreciate that breakdown and the main common experiences that most men find themselves in. And the spectrum is also helpful as well, because it's easy to interpret it in a dualistic manner. Well, it's either this or that. But what you're speaking to is the nature of change in a human, and that in any given moment, you might be on one side and then you shift into the other. But either way, if I'm understanding you, the man box is really the true north of the reference point that most men use to recalibrate, to reconfigure whatever experience they have to fit into that. And that is the issue, because it's limiting and constricting. It's not accounting for the different dynamics that, although stereotypically not accepted, actually trump those stereotypes because they're humanistically true.
Yeah. And I remember I was doing an interview, I don't know, a couple of years ago, and the guy was trying to play devil's advocate. And he says, well, it sounds like you're arguing for the wussification of men. And I just want to throw that out there because I think it comes up in a lot of listeners' head, right? Oh, well, you're just arguing for men to be pussies. And my response to this guy was, well, it seems to me that you haven't been listening very closely, because that's not what I'm arguing for. I'm arguing for the ability to have access to all aspects of our humanity, to all of our emotions without shame or embarrassment, so that we can bring the best parts of ourselves to any given situation. And the needs of a given situation change based on the situation. So for instance, if you want to go play rugby or football with other guys, it works to be traditionally masculine. That's great. Go do that. Like, there's good parts to this masculinity idea. It's not all bad. And we can bring those parts with us to certain situations. However, if you're going to date night with your wife, that's a different set of skills. You need to be a better communicator, a better listener, more empathetic. If you're dealing with your 2-year-old daughter who just fell down and skinned her knee, again, slightly different set of skills. And I would argue that most men don't have great access to the skills necessary for those latter two situations. Because I do a lot of couples work, and the biggest complaint I hear from women who are initiating 75% of the divorces in the US is, I can't connect with my man. And my thought internally was, no shit. Like, that makes complete sense to me. And here's the thing that I love about this concept is, it's not our fault. We didn't ask to be socialized like this. It just happens. And so I really like the idea that it's not your fault. It's not my fault. However, I would argue it is our responsibility to learn tools and ways to evolve beyond it so that we have greater access to our entire state of being.
Yeah, I resonate with that. And I use the same in my therapy work in regards to trauma. I say it's kind of like a game of poker. You didn't ask for the hand you were dealt, it's given to you. And you have to acknowledge that, because what that does is it prevents the shame. I mean, that's the biggest thing, right? Is that the the mishap of culture is to say it is a man's fault instead of his responsibility. And that shift is so big because many men get defensive or get shameful, whatever it is, to cope with that feeling of internalizing it. Well, hell, if it's my fault, like, how did I do it? How did I get here? Instead of focusing on it wasn't. And also, there is a different and better way of doing things. Just because you got given that hand, from that point, you have the hand. You are now fully responsible and accountable for every decision you make with that hand. And that's what you are actually judged by.
Right. And I think you hit on a key point. I think one of the keys in speaking to men and getting them to listen and consider such ideas is we have to speak in such a way so that we're not triggering shame and so that we're not triggering defensiveness, which is in many times a tall order. It's a difficult task.
Yeah, it is. But I mean, one, you need relationships with somebody to be able to feel like you can feel valued in sharing that reframe or different way of approaching it. But two, it's no matter how you deliver it, that person still might take it differently. But I think what you're getting at is I am still responsible for doing what I can to be effective. And going back to your point about the two ways that men present, being the stoicism and the self-reliance, I'm curious if you can speak to a more primal example of that with the island culture study that they found as a helpful framework.
Yeah, it's interesting just because I've talked with people all over the world about this concept, just kind of checking it out. Was this your experience growing up? Do you see this in your culture? And I've seen it all over the world in most countries. Where it doesn't show up is in certain island cultures that don't have a neighboring country next to them that is a threat to invade and take their natural resources. And in those rare situations, there's actually, it's not a bipolar model of masculinity, which would be masculine, feminine, and anywhere in between. It's a tripartite model where you've got masculine, feminine, and then something in between the two of them, which, like, think of Samoan or Tongan culture where men wear skirts, men cook for the family. They see it as an expression of love and caring. And so there's this in between that seems to be able to develop. And I love those examples because it tells us that our version of masculinity is socially constructed.
Yeah, which we need to consider again, that this was the hand that we were dealt. This is the world we were brought into and the culture in which we were conditioned. And in some ways we can't control that. But I think this study, what you're saying is it allows a different viewpoint to let us know while this is a way, it is not the way. And that's what we need to consider. We're also not asking guys to start wearing skirts and cook all the time, but we're asking them to consider the symbolism and the meaning behind that and to transfer that and to say, in our own ways, applied in our own cultures, what does it look like to adapt a more effective and really true way of being masculine? Meaning, for those island cultures, if they were to present more stereotypical masculine like we do, ironically, it would not be as masculine to them. And that's what we want to do for ourselves.
Well, and I think you bring up a really good point because I'm not saying men should do A or should do B. What I'm arguing for is I would suggest that every man take a look at these different spectrums or axes within masculinity and ask yourself, where do I want to be? Where is it best for me to be? What serves me best? So, I mean, we talked about self-reliance a little bit. We talked about stoicism, but like, think about being the provider for the family. Like, that's a really solid value, right? I can totally get behind that. However, if you think about it on a 1 to 10 scale, a lot of men that I know will peg it at a 10 or 11. And it makes sense that we start out with this value of providing for the family. We get into the workforce, and there's many men that do really well in the workforce and get promoted and get accolades, and they're respected and they're admired and they know what's expected of them. But then they go home to their spouse and their kids who, maybe are teenagers at this point. They don't know what's expected of them. They're not as fluent in the communication skills that they need to be there. They're not as emotionally aware. They don't have the emotional granularity. And so what happens is resentment tends to build up, discomfort builds up, and they in turn spend more time and energy at work. And it makes the people at home, the very people they set out to provide for initially, become angry and resentful, because if time and energy, time and attention are the currency of relationship, they're spending the vast majority of theirs at work. And so again, where do you want to be? Do you want to be an 8 or a 7 on that scale? Which seems to be a pretty good place to be in my mind, but maybe not for everyone.
Absolutely. And within that, something I could add that could be a helpful framework is you were made to be a 10 out of 10 in what you provide in, but you have to allocate that 10 out of 10 to learn to be a provider in different ways more than work. So if you are rating yourself, or the reality is you are 10 out of 10 saying the way I define myself as being a provider is through my career work, then you are over allocating, because not one type of role that you play should get all the definition of provision. Okay, but how are you providing the emotions? How are you providing the support? How are you providing the active listening skills? And I like that reframe because a lot of men do well with challenges and seeing things objectively. Well, here's a challenge. You're failing at your job and being a provider at home, and you need to show up more. But the good news is, just as much as you are the one that got yourself there unintentionally, a lot of times, to give guys compassion. Hey, I know you didn't mean to. This is a script you were told. This is what you were following, directions, following suit. But now that you've started to ask, well, why are things going to hell in a handbasket? And maybe you got to consider, I have something to do with it. This framework will help guys learn to allocate that provision.
Yeah, and let me give you one more example, because it comes up a lot in my work, and that is of competitiveness. Men are socialized to compete. And I was a competitive little shit growing up. I would compete against you in every area: girls, school, grades, sports, everything. And I had to learn to kind of tone that down, but that's another matter. So I remember I was talking to a client of mine, and because many of my clients are retired elite athletes who are now doing well in business. And this one client I had got scholarships in basketball and in track and field. And I asked him one point, we were talking about, the arguments he was getting into with his wife. And I said, so on a 1 to 10 scale of competitiveness, with 1 being, I don't care, and 10 being, I want to die to beat you, where are you on a 1 to 10 scale? And he said, I'm an 11. And I said, yeah, I figured you were somewhere up there. And I said, and that served you well when you're doing high jump or playing basketball. But when you're in an argument with your wife, that's a totally different context. And it's not about winning and losing. And you're bringing that same level of competitiveness into your arguments, and it's hamstringing you. And so I urge you to look at and consider turning the volume down on your competitiveness and reframing those disagreements with your wife.
Yeah, that is the exact same thing I tell people in trauma work, which is the survival skills that got you to where you're at are worth honoring. You would not have been able to get to where you're at without them. They're worth seeing for what they were. And they are no longer applicable because you're not surviving anymore. You are a functional, stable adult who's trying to make sense of your past. And when you are triggered by any sort of even minimal threat, deeper underneath, the trauma can flare its head, and you re-engage in the fight or flight. And even though you're not in that scenario, really common example is someone goes off to war, they have PTSD, they come back, they hear the fireworks, they drop on the ground because they think something's going on. Everyone around them who hasn't experienced that level of threat or the need for that survival skill, what's going on? It's just fireworks, right? And I think you bring up a good point, the way that we can see not just trauma, but I would just say conditionings, any narrative that you have believed that is deeply rooted into who you are, anything you would score an 11 out of 10 with, it is so deeply entangled and enmeshed into the being and personhood, it's hard to see. And it takes a lot of deep self-awareness and self-reflection. Let's go ahead and get into that. You have been familiar with Tasha Urich's work on self-awareness, that there's a study that shows while 95% of people think that they're self-aware, only about 10 to 15% are. And on top of that, we know that studies show men score drastically higher in being overconfident and inaccurate in that overconfidence, which ironically is one of the reasons that contributes to promotions, because a lot of times a woman's willing to be more honest or realistic about where she's at, and a man tends to hyperinflate So that being said, how can men develop true self-awareness, bridge that gap, and what practices have you found most effective in helping your clients?
There's an additional study that I find amusing and tragic at the same time, and I forget the exact percentage, but there's a high percentage of men that would rather shock themselves with an electrical shock than sit alone with their own thoughts. It's funny and tragic at the same time, but it's also quite telling, right? That we don't want to sit alone with the shit going on in our head. And so I think the first step for all of us, if we want to create greater self-awareness, which I think is a really valuable goal, is some form of meditation or mindfulness. And, just to sit there and observe what's going through your head as a way to get more intimately acquainted with your thoughts, your feelings, your values, what's going on in your body in terms of your physiology. What's your heart rate doing? Where's your blood flowing? Is your chest tightening up? Where's your muscle tension? What's your jaw doing? Because that's one of the ways that we can more immediately tell what we are feeling is by tuning into our physiological cues. I mean, they say that, you know this, but emotions are embodied. And so one of the first orders of business is to get our attention out of our head, to stop over identifying with the thinker. No thanks to Descartes, who said, I think, therefore I am. Totally screwed us for several hundred years, and get our attention into our body. Like, what's going on below the neck? Because that's one of the ways that we can increase emotional awareness, we can increase emotional granularity, and ultimately improve our communication. Now, on top of that, there's a bunch of other tools, and I see them as all additive. And the more of these tools you can kind of get under your belt and practice with repetition, the easier it is to kind of manage your emotional mind. But there's things like, other forms of relaxation or meditation, loving kindness meditation, progressive muscle relaxation, deep breathing, all are good ways to kind of get out of the head and into the body. And then there's, other things that we got to take a look at. And one of the things that really chaps my hide about this man box idea is I remember reading some positive psychology stuff back in the early 2000s. And I think it was Chris Peterson that was talking about how connectivity and relationships are a foundational pillar of a happier life. To which my internal response was, shit, like, now I got to go out and be social? Like, motherfucker. Because I'm a little bit of an introvert and, I'm an early curmudgeon, but it really gave me more motivation to go out and work to connect with the barista, work to connect with the cashier at the supermarket, and just these kind of little, I think what many people see as meaningless interactions with, they're 2 to 3 minutes long, but the better we get at those, the more we both win in terms of we both walk away with a positive emotional bump in that I just found a way to connect with this stranger.
Something that came to mind. This is why we know one of the main factors that on average women live longer than men is because they are more social. And on top of that, we live in a hyper individualistic
Oh my God, I'm
society.
so glad you said that.
And everything, and this is not even including technology. We're talking about what capitalism has done, what the space and geography has been for the US, and that I'm always basically, I'm in my house just with me or those around me, if now people are even having families and kids, right? So a lot of times I'm alone in a house, I'm driving alone in a car, I'm doing this. Now add technology that says, wait, dating in person, asking someone out, no, I'm good, I'll use the phone. Going to the grocery store and needing to check out and talk to somebody at the cashier, nope, I'm good on that. And what we've done is we've hyper isolated ourselves. And then men on top of that feel this extra need to, based on your first point in this conversation about self-reliance, we have misinterpreted independence with interdependence, which is you lose all sense of need for someone else, which is actually humanly not possible, which is crazy that we think it is. And the need for the socialization for men is so imperative. And I like what you said because you're reading this self-help book, right? And you would think, oh, what are the tools? Oh, if I do the cold plunge, if I do all this stuff, work out, me, if I do this, then I'll progress. And you had this moment that said, wait, if I did these things 20 times a day for the rest of my life, I still have a higher likelihood of dying sooner than someone who is more socialized and healthierly integrated to society and does either one or two or sometimes none of those things. Now, it's not an excuse. It's important to maintain the habits, but no, let's talk about that socialization.
I'm glad you said the hyper individualistic piece because I agree that our culture is hyper individualistic. And I had a wise man once told me that insatiability is the key feature of a hyper individualistic culture. And, it's one of those things where I had okay, let me go let me go away and think about this for a few months, because it's like one of the things that I'm a big fan of happiness, as I said. And one of the things that really undermines our happiness is insatiability. If I'm always looking for the next biggest fill in the blank or the next best fill in the blank, I'm never in the present moment. I'm never satisfied. I'm never content. One of my favorite emotions is contentment. What is contentment? I would say it's a mild form of happiness. How do you know if you're content? You can ask yourself right here, right now, do I have everything I need? And most times the answer is yes. And if the answer is yes, then you're content. Now, you might be also feeling other things, because we can feel multiple emotions simultaneously. But I think to practice and remind yourself, I'm feeling content right now. I love that. And what I was going to say earlier about, relationality and relationships and friendships and connection, and that being an important part of a happy life, is that we men are not socialized in that direction. Women are generally, men are not. We're socialized to be independent, to be self-reliant, to be the island. And that pisses me off, because right now we see epidemic of loneliness. We see epidemic of suicide. We see an epidemic of drug and alcohol addiction in men in particular. And there's a reason for that. And we men think we're supposed to do it all on our own. We're supposed to have all the answers. We're not supposed to ask for help, because that would be weak. And as a result, to your point, we're dying 6 years sooner on average.
Yeah, and all those stats that you point to are tied to the self-reliance, isolation, and loneliness. And I think an important offering that we could potentially discuss, and I'd be curious your thoughts, is asking what is the solution here? I think it's men's groups. I don't think they have to be officially a therapy men group, but I was listening to the podcast on a diary of CEO. I don't know if you know that one. But huge podcast, millions and millions of followers. And they brought on Scott Galloway, who's kind of become a forefront in men's work. And this other woman who is a top researcher on men. And they go through all these stats, right? And they spend an hour talking about it and speaking to all these issues. And then at the end, the host says, well, what's the solution? They say men's groups. And I think it's so radically simple, but by creating a space for men just to get together and experience other men and hopefully other healthy men, it does something innate to you that you need, and a space for you to share things. I mean, I experienced this. I'm curious how you see this, but as a married man, I'm an extrovert, so I'm the opposite of you, and I am always looking to socialize. But I also am wanting to be strategic that I socialize with people I know will make me better. And I'm really lucky that I could call 10 guys right now that I know if they picked up, it would be worth calling, that I would become a better even if they just listened or we joked, it doesn't matter. But that's a priority. And I think a lot of men have this perception, well, I'm lonely. Once I find a life partner, ding, 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 I'll be good, right? I don't need anyone else. And then that ends up being, well, I don't share with anyone but my partner, my girlfriend, my wife. And that feels so isolated and limiting, because your wife or your partner, as amazing as they are, cannot know you and is not meant to be the only social connection that you have. They're certainly the primary. And so it's been a priority for me in my life to say, who are the other guys? And I try to find a variety, right? Everyone from married, not married, want kids, has 6 kids, no, never wants kids, whatever it is. It's not that I need to be friends with them to do that, but the point is that I want a variety of masculinity in my life, of everyone that is a quality person. And that has made a huge difference when I have struggled with things, because it's not that the struggle gets any easier to deal with. It's that I can allocate the stress and struggle of dealing with it by healthily reliant on my guy friends and not just my wife.
Yeah, and I love that for you, that you have 10 male friends that you can call. I think most men aren't that fortunate, and I love the idea that you've worked to create that. I think it's very wise. Um, back to the question of what's the solution, I think men's group is a big part of this. I run a men's group on Tuesday nights, and it's amazing to me to watch the progress of men who come into the group, where all of a sudden you're in this cocoon of safety, of relative safety, where there's other men modeling, talking about emotions, talking about more vulnerable things in their lives, being real, being honest, being authentic. And the other part I love about it is that this group of men, and I think this is true for most men's group, they'll support each other, whether they're going through a really difficult time in their life or whether they just had a huge win in their life. And we don't typically have many friends that will support our successes because jealousy gets in the way a lot of times. The other possibilities are Mark Green back east started it's kind of a men's walking group idea. So he just gets together at a certain time, certain place and whoever's shows up and they go for a walk and they talk. And that started to be replicated through different cities in the US. And then the other thing that I did is I started a men's monthly dinner because I realized that this loneliness was a problem for almost every adult male that I was seeing. And so I was kind of hamstrung by the rules of what I do. And I decided to take a risk and just say, you know what? It's worth the risk to create connection. And so I went to each one individually and I said, hey, I'm thinking of starting this men's monthly dinner. The only agenda is connection. The only payment is you pay for your dinner and drinks, and that's it. Would you be interested? Everyone said yes. And now I've got a list of like 35 men that I invite once a month, and we just get together and have dinner and talk about stuff. And sometimes I'll bring a question, like who most influenced your development of masculinity? Or, how did your father influence you growing up? What was the good and what was the bad? And then we'll kind of talk about those questions a little bit, but sometimes we just talk.
Yeah, and the point you made about needing to experience both ends of the spectrum, which we traditionally only see as, well, if someone's going to support me, it's only going to be when I'm struggling. And therefore, it puts a subconscious pressure, I think, on a lot of guys who go from, I've never opened up, to now you're asking me to tell everything in a way that would make me feel supported. So now I feel needy and feeling supported. I agree that had so many healing moments with my buds when I'm laughing until tears, being the most immature I've ever been. There's a special bond that brings me back to, and you have kids, playing with my son, who's one, restoring that childlike innocence. And when you're a boy, you don't think twice about initiating relationships. Usually you just go up, you talk to whoever, you play with whoever. It's normal most of the time. I mean, though there's competition, it never trumps the spirit of play. As a kid, you always see someone, and in fact, if someone starts to get too competitive, you'll actually see them in that social circle be lowered or more ostracized.
That I talk with a lot of male clients about is this idea of sense of humor, smiling, laughing, playfulness. And I'll ask them, where did your playfulness go? Where did your sense of humor go? Because there is research that shows that our sense of humor declines around the age of 13, because I think we're, getting interested in dating and we want to be cool. And so that's when the stoicism really kind of kicks in. And then it also jumps off a cliff about the age of 23. And what happens at 23, but we get into the workforce. So my fundamental argument here is that HR has killed our sense of humor, but that's a whole nother story. But I think, to resolve to be quick and easy to smile and laugh, because our resting bitch face, our serious face, can often be intimidating and scary and off-putting. And so to remind yourself to be easy and playful, easy to smile and laugh and be playful, is a big deal. It's one of the best parts, I would argue, of masculinity, is that sense of humor. And we grew up with that typically. It's just that often it needs to be refined a little bit so we're not attacking other people's soft spots. So you got to kind of look at your sense of humor and ask, what am I doing? What do I go after? Is it self-deprecating? Is it bad puns? Is it riddles? Is it jokes from other people? Or is it kind of attacking other people's insecurities, which I would kind of get rid of? But I think it's a really important question for men to ask themselves of, how can I be lighter? How can I show up in a more playful way? And I think we rediscover that when we have kids.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. The one thing I'll add about joking when you're younger, my sense of social bonding through humor with guys is, if it's done out of content or competition, it's actually bullying, which is misexpressed play, which is, instead of using the humor for us to connect, I'm using it to divide and for me to actually become, here's me and here's you. And we lose that when initially the spirit of play says, I'm here and you're here. And it allows us to be reciprocal in that connection with no hierarchy or no competition. We both are just bonding and connecting. And the outcome is that both of us get better, versus in bullying or misexpressed play, it's one of us has to get better, one of us has to get worse. And one challenge I would add to guys in there is, along with being lighthearted, what if you saw you being lighthearted as a way to make every man around you better that you knew? And that was a primary way to combat the unnecessary competition, because the crazy part about that is if you break it down, whatever you think you could compete with them in probably isn't even applicable. Like we're so varied in what we see success in anyway that it's not going to affect you. But yeah, that's what I would say with the play.
And I think the other thing that enters into our reluctance to be playful and laugh and smile is our fear of embarrassment. And I've talked to a lot of men over the years about this, and I'll ask them, so how comfortable are you with embarrassment? And every one of them has said, I freaking hate it. And I'm like, why? What's so bad about embarrassment? I mean, at some level, I get it, but really think about it. Like, what is your problem with embarrassment? Because embarrassment to me is we violate a social rule. We look foolish. Our cheeks get red, heart rate goes up a little bit, and we want to get out of there. And it lasts for, I don't know, 30 seconds. And, some people are like, well, yeah, mine lasts days. Like, well, that's a different matter. That's you beating yourself up for what you did that was embarrassing. And I've challenged most of my male clients to practice getting more comfortable with embarrassment. Like, go out in the world and make an ass of yourself. Do something foolish, do something that violates social norms. And I did this for years, and I got really good at making an ass of myself. And it was funny because my daughter's now 19, and she got the brunt of a lot of this because I would embarrass the shit out of her, and also my romantic partner too, Jory. And it's funny because now my daughter is so comfortable with being embarrassed. She's excellent at speech and debate. She has no problem making an ass of herself. She has a great sense of humor, doesn't take herself too seriously. And it frees her up to do a lot of things where she would otherwise be constrained by worry of what are people going to think. Now, I don't think she was that appreciative at the front end. She was like, Dad, stop. But over time, now I think she wouldn't do it any other way. But it's a really interesting question. Like, how much do you hate being embarrassed, and can you get more comfortable with it?
Well, what's underneath that is, to me, the deepest core question: why do I take myself so serious? The world does not revolve around me. It's not about me. And one of my favorite quotes by Richard Rohr, he says, life happened before you, it continues beyond you while you're alive, and it will go on after you're here. Do not think that you are life in and of itself. You are a part of that. And our ability to take ourselves off of the pedestal and out of the spotlight in a way that no one meant to, and unfortunately that society allowed us to, and to reground ourselves in the embarrassment, which is not just the seriousness that we take ourselves with, but to the degree that we rely on ourselves. Because when you can be okay with being embarrassed and going for it, ironically, you feel safer enough to take risk. You come to terms with failure as a teacher instead of a barrier, and you are able to appreciate the sides of yourself that are less than ideal, that if someone saw them, actually doesn't turn them away, but draws you in. And I'm curious, I'm sure you see this in your couples work, but a lot of the work I do with men and couples work is to say, the shit you don't want her to see is the very thing that will bring you together, not bring you apart. And you thinking that if I'm honest about what's going on, if I really tell her the truth, then I might scare her away. But the deep question that many of us struggle with in our fear of abandonment and rejection is, I won't be lovable. I am not good enough as I am. And if someone saw the real me, they would run and hide. I have no shot of that. And I think being able to bring hardship to the table is a key component. And if you're okay switching gears here, I'd like to talk about that. You've been open about your experience in grief of going through hardship and losing your son. And you mentioned the daughter's speech. I'd love to hear about that, and how the profound personal loss shaped your approach to helping them process grief, and how within that you might find meaning in suffering that leads to purpose and growth.
Yeah. So thanks for the question. About a year and a half ago, Jory and I went on an epic trip to Africa, went to 3 different countries, went on safari. It was incredible. Unfortunately, didn't have time to process any of that because the day after I got home, 2 police officers came to my door, asked me if I was the father of Brett Schinnerer. I said, yes, I was. And they said, he's dead. So my son died of a fentanyl overdose at 23. He had a very difficult life. He always struggled with life. He had a hard time putting in effort in any area of his life. Was oppositional, defiant, and at the same time had a huge heart and was very loving, and people loved him. And this happened in the middle of my daughter's senior year in high school when she was going through college applications, and threatened to wipe out the year. for her. And I decided that I was not going to approach this grief like your average male. I was going to go right at it. I was going to feel it. I wasn't going to numb it. I wasn't going to run from it. I wasn't going to hide from it. I was going to talk about it with people because I know shame lives in the shadows and it will grow and fester there. And this was something I could have been very ashamed of. And so one of the things I did is I did a podcast interview with Jory 2 weeks after his death on grief and his death in an attempt to show men what it's like to feel grief, how you deal with grief, how you make sense of it. I modeled crying, sobbing at times for my daughter to give her permission to do the same. Talked with other parents. They're like, oh, we never grieved in front of our adult children or children. I'm like, yeah, I don't know. I think we need to give each other permission to feel. And I talked with Molly, my daughter, about working to radically accept that this was the new reality for us, that one of the ways you get stuck in complicated grief is to try and deny that it happened, that we have to look for meaning in it. And it was interesting because I think about 5 to 6 weeks later, her college counselor actually died as well. So even like she had notes on all her questions and essays that she had to scrap all of it because there was comments from him on all this stuff and she couldn't even look at it. And so about 8 weeks after his death, and she was geeking out on, speech and debate and Model UN and improv comedy. And she had about 5 or 6 different activities she was doing. And she had a good reputation as a speaker. And one of the teachers approached her and said, would you like to speak to the school as part of an assembly on drug addiction? So she came home and we talked about it. And I was like, I think it's a great idea. It's going to be hard as hell. And there's a possibility that you might break down crying in front of your classmates. And I don't have a problem with that at all. Like, to me, that's completely understandable. And so she did. She spoke in front of the school on drug addiction, on her brother's death, 8 weeks after he died. And she did break down and it was very moving. And it was funny because she received a lot of accolades at the end of the school year. She got student of the year from her high school. She got student of the year for the state of California for speech and debate. And one of the ways we made sense of that is that Brett, my son, is actually doing better work from the other side of the veil than he is when he was alive. And he gave her that opportunity to be heroic and to be courageous and to be resilient. And it was a way that we found meaning and purpose in the tragedy, which, one of the key ways to go from post-traumatic stress to post-traumatic growth is to ask yourself, what am I supposed to learn from this? And so it was incredibly difficult and also incredibly meaningful. I try and use all the shit and trauma and tragedy and difficulty in my life to teach others, partly because it helps me, partly because then the difficulties become meaningful, because now they're used to teach others. And also, it's life, right? It's not personal. He didn't die because I did something wrong or I screwed up. Yeah. And so it's an interesting question because I think what happens a lot of times in life, I think it's one of the main themes of life is we open ourselves up to love. We get hurt, we get smacked, we get crushed, we get knocked down. Someone breaks up with us or they die or they leave. And then when we get hurt, we close up and we close off. And I'm sure as hell not going to live that way. So then the question becomes, how quickly can I be resilient? How quickly can I open myself up to loving again? Knowing that that's just the cycle. That's how it goes. And I've met too many people that opened themselves up once or twice, got hurt once or twice, and then are like, fuck that, I'm never doing that again. I'm like, okay, but what are you going to do? Like, are you just going to stay walled off? Like, that's not living. And so resiliency is a very important and meaningful topic to me. How can we be more resilient? How do we bounce back from the shit? How do we bounce forward from the tragedy?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story. And I could feel the presence and the complex struggle you experienced in saying yes to facing it, that you knew the realities that it wasn't going to be, I face it and overcome it. It's, I'm going to face it. It's going to take us under. I'm going to have a step back. I'm going to feel like giving up and I'm going to keep going forward. I just want to commend you because I think, yes, I agree with the death of your son being something that opened up your daughter's opportunities to do what she did, and your model as a father for expressing the grief and the pain absolutely gave her a way forward and paving the way as well. Not necessarily in front of her, but just as a way to show how she could follow her own path and whatever that looked like. So I'm just thankful that you chose that path. And you talk about the core wounding being something that happens as a necessity of life. This is something we know that applies to male initiation rites, and why having a great wounding, no matter what transformative ritual you go through, is necessary. Because going back to the self-reliance, when you get wounded, you are no longer capable and able to look out for yourself fully. You have to rely on someone else. You are now at the mercy of having the help. And there's something in the wounding that not just has an opportunity for humility and to sit with it and tether you to the present, to be more real, to be less certain too, because you become a lot more open and honest and humble when you get wounded, because you realize life is not so straightforward. It can't be explained or debated away, ironically. And it's something that we have to live into. But you know what the wounding does on a deeper level as well, and maybe we can end with this in the story that you have about this, is the wounding ties to your purpose. How many people in life do you meet that what they do, not as a job, but let's say a life path, is correlated to what has happened to them, what has wounded them, what they've gone through? And so it's some encouragement to any guy. It was to me. This was a huge shift. It's not this question in my career is what do I do in life that needs to fit into a career? I reflected and said, the one thing I've been overlooking to be the source of my purpose and the trauma of losing my dad, which causes me to need support and what it means to become a man, is the very place I needed to look to find the purpose. Within that wounding and purpose, be curious to hear your physically painful experience of being blinded and what you've learned through that experience and what it's revealed in you, maybe related to purpose and reliance.
So there's a brief tangent I want to share, if that's okay. When we were in Africa, because this kind of brings it full circle to the man box, we got to meet a couple of the tribes, the Maasai and the Hadzabe. And the Maasai were telling us, the chief was telling us about, you mentioned ritual, right? And initiation rites, especially into manhood. And in the Maasai tribe, when a boy turns 13, they have to prepare for a ritual where they're entering into manhood. And the ritual is this: they're laid out on a table naked. All the men in the village come to watch, and they are circumcised without any anesthesia. That's painful. Now, here's the kicker. If the boy moves a toe, utters anything, a word, a subvocal utterance, bats an eyelash, flinches a muscle, he's ostracized from the tribe. He's kicked out. And this has gone back thousands of years. And I thought to myself when I was learning about this, holy shit, like that could be in part the origin of the man box. I can't prove that. It's just speculation, but it goes way back and it fits. So that was the thought that crossed my mind.
The physical constraints to the psychological and emotional, it makes sense, right? And that they're also more on a primal level. And so we've developed to more of a conscious understanding of it, but why would it not correlate? I mean, even if it doesn't literally, if we're going on Jung's archetypes, how could we not find it?
Yeah, it seems pretty self-evident to me. So to get back to your original question, so about 5 months ago, I was with Jory and we were in Lisbon, Portugal, and we were on a food tour. And over the course of the food tour, which was about 4 hours, I started having trouble seeing out of my left eye. And before the tour ended, I was blind in my left eye. So it happened really quickly. And I pulled Jory aside and I said, honey, I've gone blind in my left eye. I think we need to go to the ER. And so we left, we said our goodbyes, went to the ER, had to go a couple times. And they said, it looks like you've got a retinal tear in the back of your eye and it bled and your eye is filled with blood, which has caused your vision to cease functioning. And it's a really interesting challenge to not go down the rabbit hole when you're in a different country and you have a pretty severe health emergency, because, there was a couple hours where my mind was just running away with me. Oh my God, I'm going blind. I'm losing my vision. I'm losing my eye. Like, what's going to happen? Is this a stroke? Is this just retinal? Like, what's going on here? And just panicking. Fortunately, I've been practicing mindfulness for years and I allowed myself to go down the rabbit holes for a bit. And then I started practicing bringing myself back to the present moment, coming back to my breath over and over and over, telling myself, I'm going to be fine. I can handle this. They said I was fine to fly back home, just have it checked out when we get home. And I think I went down, there's probably 2 hours of rabbit holes total that I went down over about 2 days. And I was actually able to enjoy, to the extent possible, the last 2 days we had in Portugal. And I was very proud of that because it easily could have wrecked those 2 days. I could have just stayed inside, been like, no, screw it, and just felt sorry for myself and been frightened. Instead, we were out walking around the town. I was, holding Joy's hand and she was leading because of the kind of cobblestone roads, streets. But, we went out to dinner. I shared with our waiters and waitresses what had happened. They were super empathetic and understanding. We made friends with them. We went back to this great restaurant twice and then came home and a couple months later had retinal surgery. And I'm just kind of getting over that now. So I've had a gas bubble in my eye for 3 months. That just went away. So now I have to get the cornea in my eye replaced and get an artificial cornea put in. The point to me is, okay, here's more difficulty. Here's more tragedy. How do you respond to that? Is it going to help if I lose my shit? Is it going to help if I freak out? No. Okay, well, what can I do to stay calm? How do I work to keep my wits about me so that we can, one, it's not going to help physically nor mentally to just lose my cool, but then also, can I work to enjoy the remaining time we have here? And so I was very proud of the way that I responded to that. And it's taken, time to develop those skills, years. But I think it's a good example of how powerful a tool like mindfulness can be.
Yeah, I can't help but correlate you sharing that story about the tribe and the Maasai of the forced and expected suffering and the stoicism that you're forced to enter into there. And your situation, which is the unexpected suffering, having that happened, and not stoicism, but mindfulness and presence that comes through emulating a groundedness within the suffering. It's not ignoring.
I'm still feeling what I'm feeling. I'm not judging
Absolutely.
myself for feeling that way. I give myself some time to feel that way. And then I practice bringing myself back to the present moment, back to my breath.
Yeah. And the breath allows you to fully go into it instead of bypass it. If you didn't do that, it would be a disassociation from what's actually happening instead of a deep embodiment. And I think that's the core message we can take away is first, thank you for being someone that has embodied and embraced the suffering in his life in a truly masculine way that has allowed you to bring the wisdom and insight that you've shared today. But for any guys listening, go through, ask yourself, where am I in the man box? Am I expressing those 3 signals you mentioned of the stress, lust, and
Anger.
And embrace your wounding and suffering in a way that feels true, not where you're overwhelmed, but also helpful and you can move through it. So John, thank you for your time today. And before we let you go, I'm curious, where can people find what you're up to?
Thank you for asking. The podcast is The Evolved Caveman, and you can find it on any major podcasting platform. Plus, it's also at the evolvedcaveman.com. My individual work with men is at guidetoself.com. And then I've got another podcast called Love Isn't Enough, which is about couples and relationships, and that's at loveisn'tenough.net.
Well, thank you again for your time, John. We'll put all that in the show notes. And guys, until next time.
Thanks, Wes.